Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at the history and philosophy of homosexuality.
Okay.
And for this, we have a really interesting source. It's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, entry on homosexuality.
Yeah, it's really a great piece.
It's comprehensive. It has a lot in there. We're going to be going from ancient Greece to the modern era. We're going to be looking at how societal attitudes have changed towards homosexuality over time, and how our understanding of homosexuality has also changed over time.
I think this source is so great because it really brings together historical analysis, social context, philosophical arguments. It really gives you a multidimensional view of the topic.
Absolutely. I'm excited to dive in.
Yeah.
So let's start with ancient Greece. Our source says that the ancient Greeks, their concept of sexuality was a little different than ours.
Yeah, very much so.
They didn't have the same kind of black and white homosexual, heterosexual categories that we have today.
Right.
They were more focused on the dynamics within relationships and the roles that people played.
Yeah, they had these concepts of Erastes and Eromenos, which were the active and passive partners in a relationship.
Gotcha.
And usually it was an older man and a younger man. And this is that concept of pederasty, which was actually accepted within their society.
Accepted within their society. And that's really interesting to think about from our modern perspective. But if they weren't focused on sexual orientation as we understand it today, then what were the key factors that sort of shaped their views on these relationships?
Well, mentorship and social standing were actually deeply intertwined with these relationships.
Interesting.
So it was really a totally different way of thinking about things than we do today.
Right.
It just really shows how much our understanding of sexuality has evolved.
And how much culture influences what we consider natural.
Exactly.
So how did this kind of perspective on sexuality transition as we move into ancient Rome?
Well, initially, Rome actually mirrored Greece's acceptance of same-sex relationships, especially during the Republic. But as the Roman Empire rose, societal attitudes began to shift towards a more negative view of those types of relationships.
Okay.
And this was further fueled by the growing influence of early Christianity.
Right, because figures like St. Augustine emphasized procreation as the primary purpose of sex.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty big difference from the more fluid approach that we saw in ancient Greece.
Yes, yeah.
Was this shift towards this procreation-centric view? Was it something that happened quickly, or was it more gradual?
It was definitely more of a gradual process.
Okay.
You know, it took place over centuries, really.
Wow.
And you have to think about the context, too. You know, the Roman Empire at this time was facing all these internal and external pressures.
Right.
And this stricter view of sexuality may have been a way to reinforce traditional values and bolster social stability during this time of immense change.
Almost like anxieties about other things in society might have kind of been manifested.
Yeah, I think it's a really fascinating connection.
In a more restricted view of sexuality.
Yeah.
How did this then evolve into the medieval period?
Well, the concept of sodomy emerges as a key factor during this time.
Okay.
But it's important to remember that sodomy had a much broader meaning than it does today.
Right.
It wasn't just about same-sex relations. It was about any non-procreative sexual act, including even those between a man and a woman.
So even within a marriage,
right,
if the purpose of the act wasn't procreation, it could be considered sodomy.
Exactly. And that shows just how deeply entrenched this procreation-centric view had become.
Wow.
You know, thanks in large part to the theological framework that really dominated the medieval period.
Right.
Procreation within marriage was basically the only permissible form of sexual expression.
What were the consequences for people who didn't conform to that? Like, was it just social disapproval, or were there actual legal ramifications?
Well, the penalties for sodomy could actually be quite severe. Although, you know, enforcement varied across regions and time periods.
Right.
It wasn't always a consistent, harsh crackdown.
Gotcha.
But the potential for punishment was definitely there.
Right.
And it shows just how different their understanding of sexuality was from ours.
Right. So it seems like our views on sexuality have liberalized over time.
Yeah.
And our source points to the 18th and 19th centuries as a time when this change really started to accelerate. What led to this shift?
Well, one of the major catalysts was the decline of the church's dominance.
Okay.
And the rise of secular thought,
right,
especially in medicine and psychology.
Interesting.
And that's where we really start to see this idea of homosexuality as an inherent characteristic.
Gotcha.
So as opposed to a sin.
So instead of being like a moral failing, it starts to be seen as something that's like inborn.
Exactly.
Did that have any impact on how society treated people who identified as homosexual.
Yeah, absolutely. It had huge legal and medical implications. For one thing, it really sparked discussions about decriminalizing homosexuality,
Right.
which was a big step.
That's progress. What about on the medical side? How did that affect things?
Well, on the one hand, the idea that homosexuality was innate really challenged the idea of it as a sin.
Right.
But on the other hand, it also led to its medicalization.
Okay.
So it became this condition that could be diagnosed and potentially even cured,
Right.
which is, a really complicated and often problematic chapter in this history.
Right. It seems like even when we are progressing, sometimes there are unintended consequences
Absolutely.
that need to be examined.
Hmm.
So let's move into the 20th century, a period marked by some monumental shifts
Yeah, for sure.
in societal attitudes.
Big time.
And we see a gradual liberalization of sexual norms,
Right.
culminating in the Stonewall riots
Yes,
in 1969, which really ignited the gay liberation movement
absolutely.
and led to some huge steps in the fight for LGBTQ+ rights. What made the Stonewall riots so significant?
Well, it was more than just protests.
Okay.
It really symbolized this collective refusal to be silenced.
Right.
This demand for recognition and equality.
Uh-huh.
And it really galvanized the LGBTQ+ community and spurred this wave of activism that continues to this day.
So it was really like a spark
It
for a
was.
movement. What were some of the concrete outcomes of that movement?
Well, one of the most significant was the removal of homosexuality from the list of mental disorders,
Okay.
which was huge for depathologizing same-sex attraction.
Right.
We also saw increasing legal and social acceptance of LGBTQ+ individuals.
Okay.
But of course, the fight for equality isn't over, as
Yeah.
we know from things like the AIDS epidemic and ongoing backlash
Right.
against LGBTQ+ rights.
So these challenges remind us that it's an ongoing struggle
Yeah.
and the importance of persistent advocacy.
Yeah.
And speaking of challenging norms, the rise of queer theory in the late 20th century really took these conversations in a whole new direction.
Yeah.
What exactly is queer theory?
Well, it's radical in the sense that it challenges the very categories we use to define sexuality.
Right.
It pushes beyond that traditional gay and lesbian framework
Uh-huh.
and questions this idea of fixed sexual identities altogether.
So it's almost like it's asking us to dismantle the way that we think about
Exactly.
how we categorize people based on sexuality
Exactly.
and urging a more fluid understanding.
You got it. It's about recognizing the limitations and potential harm of these rigid classifications
Okay.
and embracing a more nuanced view of sexual and gender identity.
This is definitely complex and intriguing.
Yeah.
I'm ready to dive deeper.
All right, let's do it. Let's unpack these core tenets of queer theory and really explore how it challenges our understanding of sexuality.
Okay.
Get ready to have your mind blown.
I am.
It really encourages us to reconsider how we conceptualize sexuality.
I'm ready for that mind-blowing experience you promised. Where do we begin with this whole deconstruction of categories idea?
Yeah.
It seems pretty abstract to me.
Think about it this way. Queer theorists argue that the very labels we use, heterosexual, homosexual, they aren't inherent in nature. They're actually products of social and cultural forces.
So you're saying that these categories aren't meaningless, but we shouldn't assume that they're universal or natural.
Exactly. Queer theory pushes us to examine how these categories are constructed and reinforced. Language, medical discourse, social norms, all these things play a part. And importantly, queer theory argues that these categories aren't neutral. They carry power dynamics that can be used to marginalize certain groups.
I see what you mean, like how certain words can box people in, limit their opportunities just by the label itself.
Exactly. And that brings us to the term queer itself. Queer theorists reclaim this word, a word that's historically had a lot of negative baggage, to challenge this whole idea of fixed normalizing categories.
So by using queer, they're kind of turning the tables and saying, we won't be defined by your limited and often oppressive labels.
That's a great way to put it. Queer becomes this umbrella term encompassing a spectrum of sexualities and gender expressions that defy mainstream categorization. It's about fluidity. It's about resisting the pressure to conform to these predefined boxes.
Okay, I think I'm starting to grasp the broader concept.
Mm-hmm.
But how does queer theory actually function in practice? What kind of questions are queer theorists asking?
They're asking questions like, how do power structures shape our understanding of sexuality? How does language create and reinforce norms? How do medical and scientific categories control and categorize bodies? And ultimately, how can we disrupt these systems to create a more just and equitable world?
So it sounds like queer theory is deeply concerned with analyzing how power operates, often in subtle and invisible ways.
You're getting it, and one of its key insights is that heterosexuality itself is a social construct, not some natural default.
Wait, hold on. Explain that a bit more. How can heterosexuality be a social construct? It seems so biological, so fundamental to our species.
That's the dominant narrative for sure, but queer theorists argue that even seemingly biological phenomena are interpreted and given meaning within specific cultural contexts. They suggest that this idea of heterosexuality as the natural order of things has been historically constructed to maintain certain power structures, often at the expense of those who don't conform.
So even our understanding of biology is influenced by social forces.
Exactly. Queer theory helps us to see how even seemingly objective categories are often loaded with cultural assumptions and biases, and by questioning these assumptions, we can start to imagine new possibilities for how we understand ourselves and our relationships.
This is incredibly thought-provoking, but
Yeah.
I have to admit, I'm also wondering about the practical implications. Like, what does queer theory actually do in the real world?
Well, for one thing, it gives us a powerful framework for analyzing and critiquing social injustice. By understanding how heteronormativity operates, we can challenge discriminatory laws, policies, social practices more effectively.
So it's not just an academic exercise. It has the potential to drive real social change.
Absolutely. Queer theory has been incredibly influential in various fields: law, literature, feminist studies, even pop culture. It helps us to see the world through a different lens, one that questions assumptions and exposes hidden power dynamics.
That's definitely valuable. But our source also mentions that queer theory has faced criticism even within the LGBTQ plus community itself. What are some of the main points of contention?
One common criticism is that queer theory is too abstract and academic, disconnected from the lived experiences of LGBTQ plus people. Some argue that its focus on deconstructing categories can actually make it harder to build solidarity and fight for specific political goals.
So it's like the classic debate between theory and practice.
Exactly. Another criticism is that queer theory can sometimes focus too narrowly on the experiences of white middle-class LGBTQ plus individuals, overlooking the unique challenges faced by people of color, transgender individuals, and those from other marginalized communities.
That's a crucial point. Intersectionality is so important to recognizing that people experience oppression in different overlapping ways.
Absolutely. And some critics also argued that the deliberate use of the word queer, given its potentially offensive connotations, might actually be counterproductive to the goal of broader LGBTQ plus acceptance.
So the word itself, even though reclaimed, could become a barrier to understanding and connection.
That's the concern. It's a complex debate with valid points on both sides, but ultimately I think it's important to engage with queer theory, critically recognizing both its strengths and its limitations.
I agree. It's about using these intellectual tools to think deeply about how we build a more just and inclusive world.
Exactly. Our source also delves into the concept of natural law, which has historically been used to justify discrimination against LGBTQ plus people.
Right, natural law, that idea of a moral order embedded in nature that dictates how we should live. It's been used to argue for and against all sorts of things throughout history.
Exactly. And when it comes to homosexuality, natural law has often been used to argue that it's unnatural, immoral, even sinful. Those who hold this view often point to the idea that sex is primarily for procreation, and any sexual act that doesn't fulfill this purpose is inherently wrong.
It's that everything must be for procreation argument that seems to pop up time and time again. But hasn't that been challenged quite effectively? After all, plenty of heterosexual couples have sex without the intention of having children, and that's not generally considered immoral.
You're right. Many critics of the natural law approach to homosexuality point out this very inconsistency. They argue that if procreation is the sole justification for sex, then any form of non-procreative sex, including heterosexual acts like oral or anal sex, or even sex using contraception, would also have to be considered immoral,
That would make for a very restrictive view of sexuality.
to say the least. And then there's the question of what natural even means in this context, as we discussed with queer theory. Even our understanding of nature is shaped by cultural values and interpretations. So appealing to nature as a moral authority can be pretty slippery.
It's like using natural as a substitute for what I personally believe is right. But personal beliefs don't always align with justice or fairness.
Precisely. And historically, natural law has been used to justify all sorts of oppressive practices, not just discrimination against LGBTQ plus people. So it's important to be critical of this concept and how it's been used.
It's about recognizing that appeals to nature can often be used to mask deeper prejudices and power imbalances.
Well said, and this brings us to some of the contemporary debates surrounding natural law and homosexuality.
Okay, I'm all ears. How are these age-old arguments playing out in the modern world?
Well, some contemporary natural law theorists, particularly those influenced by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, have tried to refine and update these arguments. They still hold that certain human goods like marriage and procreation are essential for human flourishing.
So they're not abandoning the natural law framework entirely, but they're trying to reinterpret it in a way that's more relevant to modern society?
Exactly. Some of these thinkers argue that while homosexual acts might be considered morally wrong from a natural law perspective, this doesn't necessarily justify discrimination or legal inequalities. They emphasize the importance of respecting the dignity of all individuals regardless of their sexual orientation.
That's certainly a more nuanced approach than the outright condemnation we sometimes hear from more extreme opponents of LGBTQ plus rights.
It is, but even these more moderate natural law perspectives still face pushback. Critics argue that they're ultimately relying on a narrow and restrictive definition of marriage and family that excludes same-sex couples.
It circles back to that idea that procreation is the defining characteristic of marriage, which many people today find outdated and unfair.
Precisely. And these debates raise really fundamental questions about the role of religion and morality in public life.
Yeah.
To what extent should religious beliefs, even those rooted in centuries of tradition, dictate laws and policies that affect everyone in society?
That's a huge question and one we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely, and it reminds us that even abstract philosophical debates can have very real, tangible consequences in the world. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves, let's take a step back and revisit some of the key points we've covered so far in this deep dive.
That sounds like a great idea. It feels like we've covered so much ground already, from the social dynamics of ancient Greece to the intricacies of queer theory to the complexities of natural law. It's been a whirlwind of information, but I'm definitely feeling more informed.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? And what's remarkable is that we've only scratched the surface of this multifaceted topic. But even just scratching the surface reveals how much there is to learn and how important it is to continually question our assumptions.
Absolutely, and that's the beauty of this kind of exploration. It pushes us to expand our understanding and embrace new ways of seeing the world.
Exactly. So as we wrap up this portion of our deep dive, let's take a moment to reflect on some of the key takeaways and consider some thought-provoking questions that might guide your own continued exploration of this fascinating topic.
All right, so let's do that recap. Let's kind of look back at everything we've talked about. We started in ancient Greece, where sexuality wasn't so much about like a fixed identity, but more about the roles people played in relationships. And then we saw how Christianity, particularly figures like St. Augustine, really shifted things towards a more procreation-centric view of sexuality. And that view really dominated in the medieval period, where the concept of sodomy was used to condemn any kind of non-procreative sexual act.
Yeah, and it's amazing how that procreation focus really just stuck around for so long, shaping laws and norms and even like how people understood their own desires.
Totally. And then we get to the 18th and 19th centuries, where secular thought starts to challenge that dominance, especially in fields like medicine and psychology. And that's where we see this idea that maybe homosexuality is an innate characteristic coming out, which starts to move the conversation away from sin towards something more natural. But like you said, it also had some downsides, like the whole medicalization of homosexuality.
Right, it's like one step forward, two steps back sometimes. Even with the best intentions, you can end up creating new problems that need to be addressed.
Definitely. And of course, we can't talk about the 20th century without mentioning the Stonewall riots, that huge moment that really launched the gay liberation movement and led to some major victories in the fight for LGBTQ plus rights.
Stonewall was powerful. A real refusal to be silenced, a refusal to be pushed to the margins. It was the spark that lit a fire that's still burning today.
And speaking of challenging norms, we dove into queer theory, which pushes us to really deconstruct how we think about sexuality and gender altogether. It's about questioning these fixed categories and embracing the fluidity and diversity of human experience.
Queer theory shows us that these categories we take for granted, they aren't these natural fixed things. They're shaped by history and culture. It makes us think critically about how power works, and it opens up space to imagine different ways of understanding ourselves and each other.
So as we wrap up this whole deep dive, what are some of the big things you hope our listeners are walking away thinking about?
I think the biggest takeaway is that how we understand sexuality, and particularly homosexuality, it's always been changing, throughout history. Religion, science, social movements, cultural norms, they all play a part, and understanding that change is crucial for making sense of the conversations we're having today.
It's realizing that how we label and define things, it isn't set in stone. It's constantly being shaped by everything around us.
Exactly. And that awareness, it can help us be more compassionate and understanding towards folks who don't fit neatly into these boxes of normal or natural. It's about celebrating the diversity of human experience and acknowledging that there's no single right way to be when it comes to sexuality or identity.
And it seems like critical thinking is so important when we're navigating these topics. Whether we're looking at history or philosophy or current debates, we got to question our own assumptions and really dig into the details.
Absolutely. Especially when we're dealing with things that are so tied up with strong feelings, personal beliefs, and political agendas. It's about being willing to challenge ourselves and to be open to different ways of seeing the world.
So as our listeners continue to explore these ideas, what are some questions or areas you'd encourage them to consider? What can they take from this deep dive and keep exploring on their own?
Well, one question that feels really important right now is how can we build a society that truly embraces and celebrates diversity, in every sense of the word, including sexual diversity? What needs to change legally, socially, culturally to make that happen?
That's a big one. It's about going beyond just tolerating differences and actually working towards real acceptance and understanding.
Exactly. And I'd encourage folks to look into the intersectionality of LGBTQ plus identities too. How do race, class, gender identity, and other factors shape the unique experiences of people within the community?
Right. So, a good reminder that the LGBTQ plus community isn't this one big group.
Yeah.
There's so many different experiences and perspectives within it, and it's important to listen to and uplift those voices.
Well said. And finally, I just say never stop learning and never stop being willing to challenge what you think you know. The beauty of exploring these topics is that it's a journey, a journey of discovery that never really ends.
It's about embracing the unknown and being open to being surprised or even challenged by what we find along the way.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, on that note, I want to thank you and all our listeners for joining me on this deep dive into the history and philosophy of homosexuality. It's been a real joy exploring these ideas with you both.
The pleasure was all ours. To everyone listening, keep those minds curious, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.